Well, hey everyone, and welcome to Southridge. If this is your first time joining us in this format, I'd love to offer a few tips on how to make the absolute most of this experience. Be sure to crank up the volume during the music and sing along. Don't worry, we can't hear you. If you're a musician, download the music charts below the video, grab your instrument and play along. For any kids who are participating with us, don't worry if you don't know the words or can't read them. Just sing, dance, or make up music of your own. We're just so happy that you're joining with us today. If English isn't your first language, or if you experience hearing challenges, I'd love to encourage you to turn on the closed captioning on this video or download the transcripts for this morning's message. And be sure to download the Southridge app. This is the best way to stay connected and informed about everything that's happening here at Southridge. It's completely free and super easy to use. But for the next hour, I want to invite you to engage with this experience just as if you were with us, surrounded by a community of diverse, curious, open-minded, and inclusive people, all desiring to tap into the power and presence of God together as we worship, pray, listen, laugh, and grow. Now, there might be some things that we do or say that really resonate with you, and that's great. And there might be some things that stretch and challenge you, and we think that's good too. Ultimately, we want to encourage you to engage openly, thoughtfully, curiously, honestly, and wholeheartedly, trusting that the God that we're here to connect with is a God who is above all else love. So as we begin our time together, wherever and whenever you are, whether this is your first time with us, whether you've been around forever, we hope that for the next hour, you feel as if you're among friends. Welcome to Southridge. We're so glad you're here.
As we get started, we want to acknowledge the land that we're gathered on as a way to honor and bring awareness to Indigenous peoples and their experiences.
Long before European settler contact, the land, now referred to as Niagara, was a part of the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples.
And this land remains home to these Indigenous groups and is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty.
We acknowledge that settler colonization has resulted in historical and ongoing impacts of oppression and injustice for Indigenous peoples.
And as people who have disproportionately benefited from the actions of those who settled on this land,
Our hope is to contribute to new paths of reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and settlers,
And encourage all of us to consider how we might work towards justice for all people and all of creation.
to participate in this relational work, we invite you to join in our learning groups through the Becoming Good Relatives team,
our calls to action response group,
and everything that we're all invited to at the Friendship Centers in Niagara-on-the-Lake and Fort Erie.
So we're going to sing Make Us One, and there's language in this song around one with our sister, one with our brother, and I think the challenge there is really looking at our history and knowing that that never seemed to be Christianity's intention. Because, you think about the document of discovery, which I know was spoken about a different week of this series, and the idea of the document of discovery was I come, and because I come in the name of God, you must change. And I own this land now because you don't believe in the same God as I do. And you're not a Christian. So therefore, it's my land, first of all. And secondly, if you're going to get along with me, you almost have to change. And you have to make us one, you're going to have to do all the changing. I get to stay in one place. And you come to me and you change how you are and who you are, versus all the treaties that were part of, especially in this area, the two-row wampum. The heart of the two-row wampum is that we're each on our own streams, but one is not more valuable than the other. That is true, making us one. We're gonna journey through life, and we're each gonna be on our separate stream, and we don't hurt the other. We don't jump in and insert ourselves into the other's way of life. And, Dish with one spoon wampum agreement we're all making sure that the dish has enough in it to pass around. I'm not going to take so much that the next person then can't have the dish. That's really making us one. Yet that is not what has happened historically. My family, we're Mosquito, and we're from Nicaragua, Honduras. We are all along the Rio Coco there. And we were super converted by the Moravian Church. And when you look back at the historical pictures of our people, we looked one way before Christianity and we looked a very different way after. And that's not making us one. There's no coming together. There's no, I'm going to share what I have with you and you're going to reciprocate. And so Indigenous folks throughout time have not been invited in to make us one. So we sing these words, I think acknowledging that and being aware. We're asking to come heal lands that we had a major hand, Christianity had a major hand in destroying and in bringing harm to. So let's just pray as we begin. Okay. God, we do come with grief in our hearts, knowing that this ideal around make us one with our brothers and our sisters, there's something that just cannot ring true about that when we think about the history that Christianity has with Indigenous peoples all around the world, that folks were harmed, that Indigenous people were taken advantage of, and they were killed and they were raped and they were made to feel that they were not worth anything. There were promises that were broken, treaties that were made and then just tossed aside. And God, we sing these words, make us one, yet so often we haven't been the people that have moved towards the other groups that we've interacted with. We've said, make us one, but we've stood in one place. And so God, help us in our own lives recognize the steps that we can take, the places that today we need to be reconciled with others, that we wouldn't say, make us one from a standstill, as historically has so often been said. But instead, we would really humble ourselves and believe that we have as much to gain from others as we have to give, that we don't hold the one singular truth of what life should look like, but we would learn from others and be in good relationship with all those around us. Amen.
We confess we've been afraid. We've meant to fall upright, let all the hurt be washed away. For all the wars and violence against our enemy, come heal our hand with your great river, restore our family and make us one. Make us one. Your will be done. Make us one. Make us one. Make us one. Make us one. Let your kingdom come. Make us one. Make us one. We're all broken in all kinds of ways, but we share in this life desperate dependence on grace. There's no other born from the same dust, and if we're looking, we'll find God in every one of us. Oh, God, you're moving. You light up the dark, spreading hope to the world, revealing the love in your heart. Lord, forgive us when we think songs are enough, 'cause you said we'd be known by the way that we love. Hope is alive, living in us. Hope is alive and living in us. 'Cause if Christ arose victorious and death itself has died, hope is alive. Oh, hope is alive. May our worship be more than these words. May it be measured by those that we love and those that we serve. Never let us become satisfied as we're waiting and working for things to be put back to right. See, hope is alive. Hope is alive, building in us. Hope is alive, building in us. 'Cause if Christ arose victorious and death itself has died, hope is alive and living in us. Hope is alive and living in us. 'Cause if Christ arose victorious and death itself has died, hope is alive. Oh, hope is alive. Oh, hope is
We have broken the peace. We have come here trespassing. We've spoiled the dish. We've stolen a blessing. We have claimed as our own what our hands never planted, and hoarded the gifts that we've taken for granted. Our brother's blood cries out from the ground beneath our feet. Our father's sins handed down, but are we destined to repeat? That every nation, tribe and tongue find truth and reconciliation, that all creation join as one for the leaves on the tree of life, or for the healing of the nations.
Let us listen and learn. Let us grieve the injustice and begin the hard work of dismantling the structures. Keep us unreconciled, disconnected and fractured. Let your love make us kin, knowing every child matters.
Our Mother Earth, she groans as her wound becomes a grave. We'll bring our missing sisters home to reclaim their power and place. That every nation, tribe and tongue find truth and reconciliation, that all creation join as one for the leaves on the tree of life, or for the healing of the nations. Father God, forgive our trespasses as we make amends for trespassing. Father God, forgive our trespasses as we make amends for trespassing. Father God, forgive our trespasses as we make amends for trespassing. Every nation, tribe and tongue find truth and reconciliation, as you are making all things right, but the leaves on the tree of life before the healing of the nations, before the healing of the nations, the healing of the nations.
It's the year 2030, and everything's about to change. She is the youngest prime minister to ever take office. She's 38 years old, and she will serve for 8 years. Her dad is from British Columbia, her mom from Prince Edward Island. and she does her best to do what is right. In the third year of the Prime Minister's term, Ottawa is experiencing significant struggle with host peoples. Grassroots are demonstrating, elders are crying out, and many are publicly fasting in the streets. They are talking about broken covenants. They are proclaiming treaty rights. The Prime Minister is confused. Why are they so frustrated? Why all the protest? The Department of Indigenous Affairs tells her to ignore it. They already get more than they deserve. They're blowing off steam. It'll pass. But the Prime Minister decides otherwise, decides to do some homework. She summons a trusted secretary. Go to the Federal Archives and go to the people. See what you can find. And that's when they find it. The Treaty of Niagara, 1764. It was buried in the records, the secretary exclaims. Covered in dust. I don't think it's ever been read. Well, read it, says the Prime Minister. Tell me what it says. The secretary passes the treaty to the head of government. It's a beautiful 2-row wampum, the sacred belt of beads that Indigenous and settlers governments used not so long ago to communicate obligations to one another. As the Prime Minister studies the intricate patterns of purple and white, her secretary invites 2 elders, one Indigenous, the other settler, into the office to explain its meaning. With shared understanding, they offer these words. In August of 1764, 2,000 chiefs gathered at Niagara to meet with representatives of the British Crown, the ancestors of all this Canadian government. The year before, King George III, pursued by Pontiac's War and moved by Quaker Christian cries for justice, issued a royal proclamation which declared that all lands west of the Appalachians were to be reserved to the Indians as hunting grounds. No land could be taken by settler society, not without the consent of Indigenous. The chiefs discussed this new proposal with their communities. With copies of the proclamation in hand, they prayed and performed ceremonies as they discerned its implications. 24 nations then came together at Niagara to clarify with the Crown the principles that would govern this relationship. Principles of peace, mutual respect, and non-interference between sovereign peoples. Your government, Prime Minister, affirmed these principles, and the Indigenous in turn accepted the proclamation. To ratify the pact, wampum belts, like the one you hold, were exchanged, gifts given, and pipes smoked. The treaty was alive. It was a covenant that was to last forever. The Prime Minister is shook. She never heard any of this before. Why didn't I know this? And why don't we all know the story of this covenant? Visibly shaken, she takes off her glasses and starts to weep. Then, very quietly, she talks to herself. Perhaps she's praying. A minute or so later, she stands up, straightens her suit, and gives her secretary these orders. It's time to readdress the wrongs of the past. We haven't honored our treaty relationship. No wonder there's no harmony in our land. It's not a native problem, it's our problem. We have betrayed the promises we agreed to. It's a national disgrace. Call my cabinet immediately and get the Governor General here as well. Things are going to change, and soon. And the Canadian public marveled at the Prime Minister. She did not need to heed the treaty. She did not need to be alarmed. She did not need to depart from the ways of the old Prime Ministers, but she did. It would cost her, and she would be remembered because she did right.
We are a diverse community of imperfect people
who see the church as less of something to go to
and more as a life to be lived and shared with others.
We are continually growing in what it means to love one another,
fighting for unity rather than fighting over unnecessary arguments.
We are living to serve this world in the way of Jesus, serving those in need and those on the margins.
Knowing that friendship truly makes a difference.
So if you're coming with questions or curiosities,
hurts or frustrations,
joys or celebrations,
wondering if the church can bring clarity or hope,
or simply a place to belong,
we invite you to be at home with us.
We invite you to grow with us.
We invite you to explore with us.
And we invite you to belong with us.
Welcome to Southridge.
We're glad you're here.
Hey there. My name is Andrea Jago-Lynette, and I serve as the Welland First Impressions lead here at Southridge. We're so glad you're participating with us, and we hope this has already been a meaningful time for you. So I'm here in our St. Catharines location, and if you've never joined us for one of our in-person gatherings at one of our physical Southridge locations, we would love to have you consider joining us in person when you feel ready and able. Well, we're so grateful to have this online platform to share in this experience from wherever and whenever we find ourselves. We love it even more when we can gather together as a community. In fact, if you do come out, please come say hi to me or one of our many welcoming volunteers, and we'd love to get a small gift into your hands, just as a way of showing our appreciation for taking the time to come meet us in person. And as even more of an incentive, we actually have monthly welcome lunches for anyone who's looking to learn more about our community and wanting to connect with some folks over some delicious food. Just check out our events page on our website to see when an upcoming welcome lunch is happening. We'd love to meet you there. If, for whatever reason, you're not able to or not comfortable with joining us in person, please know that actually doesn't in any way exclude you from participating in community with us. If you need to touch base with a pastor for any reason, please simply fill out one of our Connect cards. We can't wait to hear from you. For those of us who call this community home, one of the ways we practice togetherness and express our gratitude to God and generosity to others is by regular financial contributions. This is one of the ways we can invest our lives in what God is doing in and through our church family, making a difference by meeting needs among us across our region and around the world. All of our online giving options are available on our website, and so if you're able to give this week, we invite you to do so in a spirit of joy and generosity, and we thank you in advance for your faithfulness. Now, to help you stay aware of more opportunities to engage with our community or to get involved, check this out.
Did you know that Christmas is 745 hours and 45 minutes away from this moment? That means that there's 164 hours and 45 minutes until the start of Advent, the time of year where we begin to prepare our hearts for the journey towards the birth of Jesus. This year as a community, we're going to be following the season of Advent quite closely through our sermon series and with a daily devotional. This devotional is for everyone, the person who's new to faith, the Christian since birth, adults, kids, those who'll journey through this on their own, those who might go through this devotional as a family. It's an intergenerational experience. More information next week is to come about how you can access it digitally or get a hard copy. But for families though, we've created this awesome resource to help engage our kids. It's designed for kids between the ages of 4 and 12. It is a Christmas tree. Each day, our kids will be able to add a symbol to the tree that will remind them about a part of the Christmas story. To ensure that we have enough of these Christmas trees for all of our families, we're asking that you jot down your name at the Welcome Center as you leave today. Families, please take advantage of this resource. It will be something that you can easily add into your daily routine with a short Bible reading, a 2-sentence blurb, and 2 questions. So families, please visit the Welcome Center and note your name on the clipboard there to make sure that there's an Advent calendar waiting for you next week.
That's it from me. Now we're going to hear this week's talk together. As we do, I invite you to remove as many distractions as possible and listen in to what God might want to be saying uniquely to you.
So I first started getting involved with our Indigenous community. I did a short-term life group through here. And during that group, I learned about the residential schools, the 60s scoop. Once you hear this story, you really can't ignore how the effects of colonization has harmed and still harming our Indigenous community.
When I did a master's degree at 40 years old, I had several Indigenous co-learners in my program. As a small learning pod, we got to know each other personally and collaborated on various assignments and projects. One of my classmates attended the last residential school to close in Canada, which was in 1996, and she's younger than me. This was the beginning of my listening into action journey, where I started to see that the experiences of Indigenous people in Canada are not separate from me.
It doesn't take much digging into official statistics in Canada to see that our Indigenous friends belong to one of the most marginalized and oppressed social groups in this country. A large part of this is due to the historic wrongs that came as a result of the Doctrine of Discovery, the theft of Indigenous lands, colonization, the Indian Act, residential schools, the 60s scoop, just pure racism. I don't think I can say I follow Jesus and care about the things he said and not care about how Indigenous people are treated in this country. And I don't know where I read or learned about it, but I somehow knew that Canada's Indian Act and reservation system for Indigenous people had directly inspired South Africa to create similar laws. When I would then share that Canada literally came up with part of the apartheid system with the Indian Act and residential schools, my friends were shocked. Being part of Truth and Reconciliation here in Canada in some small way not only connected me to my own heritage, but felt for me like a small way of beginning to repair the harm my own ancestors caused with apartheid.
So my experience with Indigenous peoples actually started here at Southridge about 4 years ago. It might have been the Hope Lives series, but there was a video about Schuyler Williams, and he was talking about the land back lane, the land dispute there, and he was explaining about the Haldimand Tract Treaty, and it just sort of hit me that that's where my forebears, my ancestors, came from Scotland 7 generations ago in the 1830s, and that's exactly where they settled. And that was sort of the beginning of the journey for me with, and I took every opportunity at Southridge to sort of learn and think about it and just do some reflection about my own life and my own relationship with Indigenous peoples here in Canada.
During COVID, the news came out about all the children that were, the children's bones that were found. So that was quite, I think a lot of people became aware of the connection with the residential schools and the harm that was done there. I think that people matter and they have great value. And if I believe that and I want to love people, then I can't really separate who I want to love. The Indigenous people are so a part of this land and a part of this country that we need to treat them with respect.
When I was in university 2 decades ago, I was studying in Toronto and I was invited by some of the other students who I played hockey with to spend a week up in Attawapiskat in Northern Ontario to help run a hockey clinic. Now, Attawapiskat's a reserve. It's an Indigenous community of about 1,500 Mushkegowuk people. It's way up north. It's just west of James Bay, the body of water that's just at the bottom of Hudson's Bay. Just to get there, we drove 24 hours, first to Moose Factory, and then our van was loaded onto a train, which we took overnight to Moosonee. You can't actually drive into Attawapiskat for a lot of the year, but it was January, and so from Moosonee, we actually drove on a long and winding river that was frozen, 4 feet thick, for a couple 100 kilometers. And when we were there, we slept in the community center at night and ran the coaching clinics on the rink with local teenagers, before school and then again after school, every day. It was like minus 30 all week. The roads between the houses were just icy snow. Snowmobiles were the main form of transportation, of course. And there were packs of somewhat feral huskies that were roaming everywhere that we actually had to be careful of. And these teenagers were fantastic at hockey. And they had so much fun on the ice. And they played with such a joy, despite the fact it was the absolute coldest rink that I've ever been in. It was just a metal box without insulation and in the middle of those crazy temperatures. And they welcomed us in during that week with openness, kindness, cultural experiences just throughout the community. Now, the residents of Attawapiskat face challenges that we probably don't equate with fellow residents of our province. food is expensive for us these days, but the cost of food in Attawapiskat has always been astronomical. Before the prices went up these past few years, when the milk in Niagara cost $5, for example, in Attawapiskat it would cost $11. $10 ground beef here was $20 there. In a case of 24 water bottles that we'd buy for $3, $37 in their community. Now, the water bottles in particular are significant because Attawapiskat, like many reserves, has problems with accessing clean water. A few years ago, they were forced to declare a state of emergency because of the quality of the water. And it wasn't like, the water tastes funny, or even like, it looks a bit brown coming out of the taps, which would be problematic enough. But in fact, it wasn't even simply a problem of being drinkable. Their water hadn't actually been drinkable for years. But at this point, it had gotten so bad that the people were being advised that they shouldn't bathe in the water for more than 3 minutes, and not to bathe in hot water at all, because it would open their pores and the chemicals would harm them more easily. And either way, the water emitted powerful or harmful chemical vapors into the air, and it made the air in people's houses toxic as well. We heard about various challenges facing the community while we were up there for the hockey clinic. We expressed concern, sadness. We offered our sympathies. We played hockey as our contribution. Went home and showed pictures of our adventure. For me, I'm ashamed to say, I generally forgot about Attawapiskat after my experience there, as good as it was for me, and as challenging as were the things that I'd heard about. At least until about 10 years later. I was living overseas, but little Attawapiskat was in the news. It wasn't because of the impossible situation with their water. It's because of a crisis of suicides and suicide attempts by young community members. They had about 100 attempts over the course of a few months in this small community, 30 in 30 days at one point. You remember that? You might remember that being in the news. I remember having a moment after reading about this where I had kind of like a mental image, as if I was looking at the globe, as Google Maps, and kind of zoomed from where I was to Canada. And I just sort of looked at it, and it was like I'd never seen it before. I pictured the vastness of the country, and tiny Attawapiskat, with the faces of the incredible boys that I'd gotten to know for a few short days before carrying on with my life. And I couldn't fathom what they were facing, the despair that they were clearly feeling, and which I'd begun to understand was actually common among a disproportionate number of Indigenous youth. And as I observed my country, as if kind of for the first time, I thought, I haven't actually been seeing. I haven't been seeing what the Indigenous peoples and specific Indigenous persons are experiencing right in the country that I've assumed I fully understood. I haven't recognized my role, my history in that experience. Now, before we continue, let's take a time out for a moment. We've been sharing stories and histories in this series as we've been looking at God's vision for the healing of the nations, as Tom shared with us in the first week. 2 weeks ago, Lori and Adrian shared with us about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the ways that we haven't lived into God's vision. The exposing of the tragedy of the residential school system that the church in Canada ran in the name of Jesus, and the devastating truths of what was done to Indigenous families and children for generations. Well, last week, Jeff led us into a discussion about the doctrine of discovery, which, as he taught us, is the legal and theological framework of dehumanizing Indigenous peoples for the express purpose of taking their land. That allowed and encouraged systems like the residential schools to exist and flourish as a Christian mission, a framework that has practical implications to this day. So as we're slowly learning, the harms and the brokenness in this history has unfolded over a long time, right? And there's a lot there, and it can feel overwhelming. But earlier this month, Adrian Jacobs said that Indigenous people are not trying to make somebody feel guilty, as he said. And even as he then said with a bit of a wry smile that Western Christians often feel guilty enough as it is. Instead, he said, the point of us knowing all of this is to be honest about the things and to call people into what he said was a responsible, healing relationship. So I hope that you've been hearing the stories and teachings in this series not as an attempt to inspire feelings of shame, rather as an invitation to the freedom, as Jesus calls it, of truth. That's something that's worth saying at the end, but it's also worth saying right now. If you're hearing all of this and it's only inspiring shame, please release that. Because Jesus actually offers release of shame, not a compounding of it. Instead, hear the invitation to a freedom that you may not have even known that you were invited to experience on the other side of responding to these truths. Okay, so end of timeout. Now, one of the most significant moments in the history of Canada is actually the creation of the Treaty of Niagara. This agreement was at the start of the formal relationship between the British and First Nations of Canada. And it laid out the foundation building principles of how these nations, the nation of like European settlers, different First Nations, Indigenous communities, would actually behave towards each other. So the formation of this treaty happened in 1764, over 100 years before Canada even existed. Right at the lands at the mouth of the Niagara River, where it spills into Lake Ontario. It took place over the course of a month. And there were over 2,000 delegates from 24 First Nations that joined the British there. So together, assurances were made that the British would respect Indigenous sovereignty and territory. They agreed that no settlements would be made without permission from Indigenous communities. There were literal boatloads of gifts that were exchanged between different people there, and 84 wampum belts were exchanged, as traditional signs of peace and respect and agreement, respect for spirituality and shared values. These are like painstakingly created out of 10,000 tiny beads to reflect the importance of these agreements. The foundation of all these negotiations and the treaty that emerged lay in three basic principles that were agreed upon between everyone, Indigenous and settler. And they were peace, friendship, and respect. Now, these promises happened right here, like a few kilometers away. Now, in the story, which we read earlier in the service, Canada's Prime Minister is a young woman who, through a trusted secretary, finds this forgotten agreement, the Treaty of Niagara. Now, you may have recognized this as a retelling of a story from the Old Testament and from the book of 2 Kings, in which Judah's young king, Josiah, finds a dusty old book in the midst of renovating the neglected temple. He reads it and is overwhelmed by a devastating truth. God had partnered with his people, had clearly laid out a way of living in a good way, and they had made promises, a covenant together. But as Josiah now had the sickening realization, he and his people had been neglecting this covenant, this way of being and of behaving towards others, this relationship with God for generations. It tells us that Josiah is overcome and he tears his robes. That's an act of emotional grief. He's also expressing that grief in the symbolism of his culture. Tearing one's robes was a visible image of the invisible damage to one's heart that a person is showing that they'd suddenly experienced or become aware of. It's also an exposing of nakedness. It showed that I've been exposed by loss or grief or shame. I can't hide from what's real, whatever the embarrassment I feel. So Josiah tears his robes because he now knows a hard truth, and he knows that he's not going to hide from it. In the story of the young prime minister, after some research and digging around in the archives, the Treaty of Niagara is rediscovered. It had been hidden and it's dusty. It's been neglected and forgotten, just as in reality, its promises have been neglected, broken, forgotten. The parable speaks to the reality that we've been learning about through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the impacts of the doctrine of discovery and beyond. That is, the promises of peace and friendship and respect in the Treaty of Niagara and in the way of Jesus have largely not been honored. As we hear the stories of broken treaties and harmful systems, dehumanizing beliefs, and if we feel the classic deflection kind of bubbling to the surface, that wasn't me. And then even beyond the similarly classic response, yeah, but have you benefited from any of that? Please hear Jesus saying, you're answering a question that I haven't asked. I didn't ask if you did the most harmful acts. My question is, will you now see and love your neighbor? The young prime minister and Josiah each received information that they chose to see as unignorable. And their two pieces of unignorable information combined to both be true for us today as well. There are some remarkable, groundbreaking promises of peace, of friendship, and respect that were made right here in Niagara between non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples. And these were not upheld. And the Prime Minister wept. And God has made a covenant with God's people to partner with God to live in God's way of life, and this has been neglected. And Josiah tore his robes. But it doesn't end with the weeping and tearing of robes. They then share with their community. And once it's shared with the community, as it says in 2 Kings, then all the people pledged themselves to the covenant. It's a communal act of holding each other accountable, to take these steps together. To now, together, pick up the treaty, the wampum belts that have been neglected. Because, by the way, it's another side note, when we found something that's true, and we can't keep it to ourselves, we need to share it. That's what it means to be followers of Jesus, to be disciples of the one who is the way, the truth, the life. In the book of John, in the New Testament, we read that Andrew meets Jesus for the first time and spends the day with him. And then as he leaves, it says, the first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, we have found the Messiah, that is, the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. The same is true when we experience Jesus now, when we see the way, the truth, and the life of Jesus in the places that Jesus calls us to, with the people that Jesus calls us to. We need to share that together and go there together, invite each other into those spaces. And I would suggest that when the Becoming Good Relatives team is inviting us to come and see, as you've heard, they're inviting us to spaces that they've experienced the invitation of Jesus, that invitation to truth and to reconciliation that leads to the peace of Christ. So, having received these truths that to us have become dusty, neglected, how do we respond? The first answer is we don't know. There isn't an exact formula, but like Josiah and the young prime minister, we want to choose to engage rather than ignore. And there are indicators of first steps that can allow us to see more. The calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission serve as a good starting point. As we've heard, the 5 calls to action that are specific to the church involves themes like, learning about the experiences of Indigenous peoples, listening to Indigenous peoples, financially supporting Indigenous-led initiatives towards healing, and then personalizing, both through rejecting and dehumanizing doctrines, and then adopting and humanizing covenants and friendships. In regards to call to action number 61, regarding financial support, a number of us from our community have been participating in some learning sessions with Indigenous Mennonite author and teacher Sarah Augustine about how to move towards financial reparations as a community, as a part of a healing process. A few Mennonite churches have taken the responsive step of creating a new covenant with local Indigenous groups regarding starting to contribute 1% of their annual budget towards local Indigenous-led healing programs. Is that something that we could move towards? And let's let this serve as a part of the start of that conversation as a community. We're hoping to discuss more of that together in the next year. And we're inviting each of us to start prayerfully considering, what it could look like for us as a church to take a financial step in that direction. In regards to learning about the experiences of Indigenous peoples, listening to Indigenous peoples and personalizing connection among Indigenous peoples, our Becoming Good Relatives team has been exploring this for themselves and on behalf of our church. And they'd like to invite us to join in. These invites are not formulaic and they're not overly complicated even, but they attempt to honor the intention of the calls to action, and in doing so, to reflect the ways of Jesus. So things like a book club, reading books by Indigenous authors. In this case, novels by Indigenous authors, talking about life and hopes and struggles and families and vacations and sharing these stories. We'll also be doing this learning by leaning into the storytelling of what's called a blanket exercise practice later this winter, which will physically walk us through the experiences of Indigenous peoples and settlers on the land. And we feel that everyone in our church should actually experience this powerful practice. So both of these are part of the work of learning, as beginning responses to call to action number 59. We also want to listen to the invitations from Indigenous peoples as a part of call to action number 60, which calls us to respect Indigenous spirituality in its own right and to take responsibility to prevent spiritual violence. Here the invitation is to participate in spaces where we can listen, such as the Strawberry Thanksgiving next spring, the local powwow here next fall. Lastly, we want to lean into the personalizing invitations, humanizing, neighboring, kinship, leading to repudiating the doctrine of discovery and fully respecting Indigenous peoples, as we see in calls to action number 48 and 49. The current invitation towards this type of relational connection comes through the Niagara Regional Native Center in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and the invitation to attend their meal and drum circle evenings once a month, alongside two of our Becoming Good Relatives team members. We're going to extend this invitation a little bit more specifically to you in a few moments. Friends, we've been hearing from teachers in different Indigenous communities who have said that it has taken generations to get to where we are today, in the separation and the harms that are present. And so it's going to take generations to repair and heal together as well. So instead of being incapacitated by the weight of it all, by our inability to know what to do, we're invited to simply start with the next faithful step towards reconciliation. We all know the expression, a journey of 1,000 miles, kilometers, begins with a single step. The invitation that we believe that we're being invited to as followers of Jesus on this land is to take that first step. I personally still don't know what to do with the truths of the harms that Indigenous peoples have experienced. Especially those experienced at the hands of Christian settlers, Mennonites, my people. But I'm now attempting to acknowledge the truth as I continue to learn about it. In the midst of my internal apathy and even resistance, I also have an openness that I'm working towards to steps in my life, in the life of my family, and the life of my church community. And it's been a slow journey for me for the past number of years. But my reading has started to include books by Indigenous authors that have started to inform my perspective. Often with a sense of humor in the writing that really amazes me. My wife Taryn and I have had the chance to be in different circumstances that have started to teach us. Like the meals with the land defenders up at 1492 Landback Lane, or drum circles at the Niagara Regional Native Center. And we're seeing a slow change in our perspective, our values, our actions as Christians on Indigenous lands. Perhaps the most significant piece of this for me, for Taryn, is to see our 3 boys being raised in the perspective that we're slowly gaining. They hear stories of Indigenous peoples included in the books that we now read to them, and they now specifically bring books home that are similar from school, expanding and learning more. They spend time in context with us where Indigenous communities are real and active people, good people that they get to meet, rather than being solely shaped by the cultural forces of apathy and distance, which can create suspicion. Perhaps the Treaty of Niagara can be dusted off through our actions, and increasingly through the actions of our young ones. And it gives me hope that if I can slowly but steadily take ongoing steps towards truth and reconciliation, that the children of our community and the children of Indigenous neighbors and kin will have a new story to tell the next generations. Please, Jesus, may it be so. Amen.
As a Christian, I believe that God calls us to stand with people experiencing oppression, to stick up for justice and work for good of all creation. We looked up the local church near us, Southridge, and they were starting a short-term group reading the book Unsettling the Word, Biblical Experiments in Decolonization. We just had to join, and the short-term group pretty much sold us on coming to Southridge. We joined more online virtual groups after that, learning about what was happening here in Niagara. Jesus was in solidarity with people who were oppressed, marginalized, and facing injustice.
I've been intentionally educating myself through books, podcasts, online courses, and paying attention to invitations for someone like me, a non-Indigenous person, to show up. If the good news is actually good, it must be good for all people. If it's actually good for all people, then following Jesus means that my life and our lives are entangled.
It's about Jesus. He came alongside everyone. He loved everyone. He loved the rich, the poor, the marginalized, and he's called me to love my neighbor as myself. And so I think Indigenous peoples are my neighbors.
Getting to meet Indigenous people personally and making a connection, like that has really been the highlight of my my journey.
And I think this is how Jesus wants us to live, in harmony with one another. He was here to show love to the world, and that's what we need to be continually doing, not just in our own little community here at Southridge, or our community in St. Catharines, or Welland, or Vineland, our whole community, which involves a lot of Indigenous folks.
To me, that means we each have a part to play in getting involved, which can mean everything from learning more about the issues of injustice people are facing, reading books, educating ourselves. You don't have to have some special knowledge or unique skills. You just need to have a willingness to show up, to learn, and to listen.
It all comes down to this. Will you require me? Love my neighbor and myself, and you above all things. Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly. Will you guide in all things? song. Faith just like a seed, the only way it grows. Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with you, God, in all things, always walk humbly with you, God. Oh, act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with you, God, in all things, and always walk humbly with you, God.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope that you felt inspired and challenged by our time together. Now, we know that for what we've heard today to really become reality in our daily lives, it's going to take more than this 1 hour a week we spend together. It requires a moment by moment, 7 days a week commitment to practicing the way of peace and the way of Jesus. And that's why we provide a host of ways to continue to lean into God's presence while we're apart from each other. As always, you can click on the Practice This Week button below the player for daily spiritual exercises to continue to develop the muscles that we've started building together today. And if it helps, you can also opt into the spiritual practice notifications on our app to get those helpful reminders every morning as you start your day. And if you'd like a more personal conversation with someone about anything at all that's going on in your life, we want to invite you to reach out to our location pastors who will simply follow up with you privately. You can fill out our Connect card and you can find it on our website or our app. So that's all for now. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care and have a great week.